Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the webinar by Australia's National Research Organisation for Women's Safety, also known as ANROWS. My name is Amanda Gillett. I'm Manager of Community and Organisational Development at the Metropolitan Migrant Resource Centre in Perth, Western Australia. Before proceeding, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land across Australia on which we meet today, and on behalf of ANROWS, pay respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are viewing this webinar. I would also like to acknowledge the Noongar people, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I am on today, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. I would also like to acknowledge the impact of COVID-19 on everyone, most particularly on women experiencing domestic and family violence, and the practitioners in the frontline services. Today's webinar is titled Enhancing Practice when Working with Men from Refugee Backgrounds Who Use Domestic and Family Violence. The webinar will explore the findings of the recently published ANROWS report, Best Practice Principles for Working with Men from Refugee Backgrounds Who Use Domestic and Family Violence. This research was led by Professor Colleen Fisher and co-authored with Karen Martin, Lisa Wood, Elizabeth Lange and April Pearman. This research is one of the final projects to be published from the Perpetrator Interventions research stream at ANROWS. We'll now turn to the panel. I'll introduce them to you, and please be advised that the full bios of the panel members are online on the registration page. So we have here Professor Colleen Fisher from the University of Western Australia, Mark O'Hare, Operations Manager with Stopping Family Violence, and Elizabeth Lange, CEO and founder of Diversity Focus. The format of today's webinars will be, firstly, the presenters will speak on the topic and the research, and then there will be a panel discussion. Then the audience can submit questions to the panel for a live Q&A. You will note that there's a blue icon on the top right-hand side of the screen, and when you click on that, it will take you to the question box where you can type in your questions. So over to you, Colleen, from the University of Western Australia, Professor Colleen Fisher. Colleen,
great,
Can you tell us about your research, the best practice principles for interventions with domestic and family violence perpetrators from refugee backgrounds, and what prompted you to look into this area, and what practice or policy gap does the research aim to address?
Great, thanks Amanda, and good afternoon to everyone. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands who are all present today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'm really pleased to be able to talk about the research today. I think at the outset, what I'd really like to acknowledge is that it was undertaken in a collaborative and participative way with members of the refugee communities, and they were involved as key advisors, as members of the research team and as participants, and I'd really like to acknowledge that vital contribution. I think it's also important to let everyone know at the outset what we mean when we're talking about intervention in terms of this research. It's really quite a broad term that encompasses community education and awareness raising, and also primary, secondary and tertiary interventions. So why did we undertake this research? Well, I guess there were three contextual issues that coalesced and prompted us to undertake the study. The first is that Australia has a long history of settling individuals and families who are fleeing persecution, war and violence. Since about 1947, we've taken over 800,000 refugees and they've settled with us in Australia. So when we open our doors to those who are seeking safety, I believe that as a country we have a moral obligation to really ensure that we do provide appropriate support and services for those who enter. As a research team, we were really aware of the dearth of domestic and family violence services, specifically for those from refugee backgrounds, but even more acute is the lack of services specifically for those who use violence. And when we went back to the literature for a bit of guidance and evidence around this, what we found when it's specifically related to the use of domestic and family violence by those from a refugee background, there was actually very, very little there. But where literature did address domestic and family violence perpetration, in the vast majority of instances, that research actually included also those who freely migrated to Australia. So we saw the term over and over again, migrant and refugee, or cold and refugee. So in effect, the experiences and the needs of those from refugee backgrounds were conflated with those who arrived as migrants. So while there are similarities in the settlement experiences of migrants and those from a refugee background, there are also experiences that are unique to the latter, and that has implications for developing and implementing interventions. I'm talking here things like trauma, conflict, loss, force, displacement. They all add layers of complexity that really we should be taking into account when we're developing and implementing interventions. And added to this context, as I've said before, is the reality that there's a dearth of intervention specifically for those from refugee backgrounds who use violence. So in this project, our intent was to develop a set of best practice principles that agencies could draw upon to inform development of interventions that ensured the safety of women and children and held those who use violence accountable for that violence, that would facilitate the development and implementation of high-quality interventions that were culturally appropriate in both their delivery and their development. We also believe that if interventions were developed based on a set of evidence-informed best practice principles, we have a much higher likelihood that there would be equity in the interventions across locations. So how did we undertake this study? Well, in developing the principles, it was really important that our research methodology was robust. There's a lot at stake when we're talking about this issue. So the research drew on the combined expertise and experience of community members, including those with lived experience, on the knowledge, experience and insight of those professionals who provide support and services to communities from a refugee background in issues related to domestic and family violence, and also drew on the very limited literature that is available. So we had a 3-phase study with phases 1 and 2 informing phase 3. In phase 1, literature on the topic was sourced and the findings from that literature were analysed and categorised according to content. In phase 2, in-depth interviews undertaken by trained bicultural and bilingual research assistants are undertaken with 40 members from 5 refugee background communities, and those communities were selected based on maximum variation in terms of population size, ethnicity, religion and geography, really to reflect the broader refugee population. And we also took focus groups with professionals who work with refugee communities and professionals from the domestic violence and related sectors. So the data from phase 2 were analysed using a content analysis. The findings were then combined with phase 1 analysis, and the themes identified were worded to reflect a candidate best practice principle. From that analysis, we came up with 12 candidate best practice principles and associated sub-principles. Phase 3 was a 2-round Delphi process, and Delphi is a technique that's used to arrive at consensus around an issue. So in this phase, the candidate best practice principles were forwarded in a questionnaire to a national panel of 27 individuals who are from cold backgrounds and who work with refugee communities around domestic and family violence. We asked each of the members to rate from very unimportant to very important each of the principles, and also rank them from 1 to 12 based on importance, and provide us with justification, with comments that would justify both their rating and their ranking. So after we analysed round 1, our analysis showed that all the candidate best practice principles should remain because they were seen as important. And the literature also suggested that having 12 best practice principles is actually, appropriate. So in the second round, the panel members were sent the results from round 1 and asked to change or not change just their ranking of the principles, because after the rating in round 1, they all remained in the mix. So the final result was a set of 12 best practice principles and associated sub-principles. And what we also found was that the ranking of those principles between 1 and round 2 remained fairly consistent across the board. So our results, our key findings, our result was a set of best practice principles. The safety of women and children and perpetrator accountability for their use of violence, as we all are probably aware, are the bedrock upon which all formal responses to perpetrators of domestic and family violence in Australia are based. And they're included here as overarching principles, along with a principle that intervention should be trauma-informed. Now, so I think it's really important to point out at this stage is if any of the 12 best practice principles are in tension with one or more of these overarching principles, these 3 overarching principles must prevail. So in terms of the 12 best practice principles, I won't recount them here, but they broadly fall into 4 main categories. The first is around interventions working to empower women and coming from a strengths-based approach. The second broad category relates to interventions should be developed and delivered through genuine engagement and partnership with refugee communities. Thirdly, it's around diversity, so interventions recognising and responding to diversity and value diverse family structures, and also recognise the diversity that exists in communities from a refugee background, both in terms of its makeup, but also the diverse difference in understanding of domestic and family violence in an Australian context and also Australian responses to it. And finally, complexity. So interventions really should account for complexity, so both the complexity within communities, but also account for complex individual experiences of those who are using violence, both those experiences pre-settlement and post-settlement. And just finally to say that really to embed these best practice principles, there are naturally implications for policy and for practice.
Thank you very much, Colleen. And, thank you, I think, in particular for pointing out that the research that does exist has, generally speaking, conflated refugees and CALD, and we've often failed to look at the very specific factors that are associated with the refugee experience and how this might feed into the whole situation of family and domestic violence in those communities. We're going to turn now to Elizabeth Lange from Diversity Focus, and you would have heard Colleen referring to those principles, the 3 overarching ones and the 12 other principles to guide practice in developing programs and delivering services to men who use violence from refugee communities. Elizabeth is going to speak to us in a little bit more detail about some of those principles, and in particular, we're going to talk about Principle 1, which is perpetrator interventions respect diverse family structures, values and strengths. Principle number 5, which is that perpetrator interventions account for diversity in understanding of domestic and family violence and Australian responses. And principle number 7, whereby perpetrator interventions recognise and respond to community complexity. So could you, Elizabeth, expand a little bit more about those principles and what they might look like for organisations to actually put into practice when working with men from refugee backgrounds?
Sure. Thank you. I'd also like to echo the earlier remarks around the acknowledgement of country as well, just to acknowledge where we all are. I know that we're across Australia and a few from New Zealand, so recognising the traditional custodians of the land in which we're each sort of dialing in from. So I'm going to talk about cultural community dynamics, and I'll begin with the notion of the conception of family and how the idea of family can be understood and also experienced differently across different cultural contexts. Firstly, the very definition of family varies across societies and across cultures. Collectivist cultures generally have a much more expansive definition, of the family compared to Western understanding. And this has an impact on several layers. Also that the parameters placed around domestic and family violence, of which there are particular assumptions of what the family looks like, has implications for individuals and families with a refugee background who often do not ascribe to this understanding. It's important in putting the principles into practice that services are able to appreciate the vast differences across and within groups, and also be guided in their practice by the experiences of the clients that they're working with and of the communities. It's imperative also that client experiences are understood through their specific context as well. I think culture gives us one lens from which to understand people's experience, but it needs to go beyond the particular cultural context and to look at the individual as well as the familial context, because often people have a history of migration where they might have lived in different countries, etc. Also, I guess in talking about the family units further, to appreciate that the impact of migration and the process of acculturation, I guess it impacts on the family in different ways. The process of migration and settlement is hugely challenging for the family as a unit. Members of the family experience these challenges in very different ways. I know for myself, having come to Australia through the refugee pathway as a child, I'm now aware, particularly now as an adult, and also I guess as a mother now myself, but also within the context of the work that I do in this sector, how our experiences as a family were so different. My particular experience as a child was very different to my older siblings who were teenagers at the time, and that of both my parents were also vastly different because we experienced acculturation at different speeds and in very different ways as well. Our engagement with systems such as education system and the health system, etc., were also vastly different. So it's important that practitioners are aware of this and that their work is guided by this understanding in working with the family collectively as a unit, but also in appreciating individual contextual differences of the members of the family. I want to talk about also the absence of protective factors, because pre-arrival, the extended family and community, as well as other resources, provide individuals and families with, in what I think in many circumstances are preventative factors, but also are protective factors that are often missing once families are resettled into Australia or in other parts of the world where they may be resettled as refugees. It's important to recognize how this can increase the likelihood or severity of violence and abuse, because for some families, domestic family violence features for the first time after resettlement. And I think that's in recognition of the post-arrival issues around settlement, around resettlement, and the challenges around acculturation, as well as other factors that people are confronted with once they've arrived. I want to go into responding to complexity and touch on one of the points that Colleen mentioned earlier as well. So in appreciating complexity, it's important that we apply an intersectional framework to understand diverse experiences. The framework of intersectionality can be used as a prism from which to understand how multiple forms of social inequalities will often intersect to create entrenched disadvantage. This also ensures that individuals and families are supported in a manner that is specific to their context and which recognizes social inequalities such as racism, such as sexism, and how these intersect to create a very unique experience, but also often a very complex experience for individuals as well. It's also important to, I guess, appreciate the fact that there is diversity within communities and to understand that the experiences of individuals and families within their particular context. It's important also to recognize that diversity is not only across but also within cultures, whether that is linguistic diversity, religious, ethnic, etc. Also, diversity of experience and often migration context also adds another layer as well. People's identities are also fluid and made up not only of their cultural background, but also of the impact of the refugee migration process, such as the fact that an individual or a family has interacted with and lived with groups that may be very different in terms of nationality, language, culture, religion, pre-arrival, and obviously that continues post-arrival once they're living in Australia as well. In working within the principles of cultural responsivity, it's about applying a culturally responsive practice approach, which comes from a place of humility and of appreciating difference and the feelings that as a practitioner one may have towards that difference. It also requires that services understand the specific context, contextual needs of a client and aim to work with those. And also this requires that individuals and services are aware of their internal biases, which can hinder an effective response to domestic and family violence. I'm just going to cover also working with the resources within communities. I think it's particularly important that communities are seen as being a resource in and of themselves. Communities are essentially also providing a service from within. I think we often look at groups from a refugee background from a deficit perspective that fixed on seeing the problem, which leaves us blind to the resources and opportunities within communities. It's also important to understand that the first responders to domestic and family violence are often not domestic and family violence service providers. They're often trusted individuals within communities at the grassroots, be they professionals who work in the field or maybe not necessarily, but they're just individuals within communities that have a passion or a personal commitment to supporting their community members, etc. The last point I just want to touch on is the notion of representation and the lived experience. And I know Colleen touched on this as well with regards to the approach that was taken in the research, which has allowed us to gain some really robust data from our participants. It's important that in order for an intervention to be effective, that it's informed by the lived experience. Part of the effectiveness of this research, as I've mentioned, and particularly the depth of data we were able to obtain through the interviews came from the fact that bicultural research assistants who were multilingual were recruited and trained to conduct the interviews within their own communities and with the language of the participants where that was necessary as well. Representation is also hugely important so that communities are able to speak for themselves rather than being spoken for by services who may not necessarily understand the issues from within. There is also a range of emerging grassroots community organizations and associations in various refugee background groups, and there will be many different. I know we're all from different parts of Australia and New Zealand. Without a doubt, in your respective states and territories, there will be grassroots community-based organizations. But if I were to give you two examples from Western Australia, the Korean Welfare Association in WA, for example, and the Organisation of African Communities in WA, among many more, are also developing and delivering community-based services by and for communities. They have the benefit of both the contextual understanding and a level of trust that many funded services often do not have. Such groups are a huge resource, and the work being done at the grassroots by individuals in cultural communities from within needs to be recognised and further supported. And I think as practitioners, there's also a real advantage to working collaboratively with communities because you have a natural bridge into the community as well. And for a topic as sensitive as domestic family violence, that is very, very crucial. So that's all from me for now.
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth. And it was very interesting that you raised those issues of, I think for me, what jumps out there is the need to really understand the context of family and what family might mean to different communities and different people. The issue of the intergenerational acculturation, which we know can really be quite a major challenge for families who've just arrived from other countries. The need to also look at individual differences and not just rely on the framework of culture, and to really use the framework of intersectionality to help us understand the level of complexity that people from refugee communities face when dealing with these kinds of issues. Thank you very much, and we'll move now to Mark from Stopping Family Violence, Mark O'Hare. And Mark, Stopping Family Violence provides training on men's behaviour change programs. In your experience, what do you hear from practice organisations about working with refugee men? And what sorts of challenges do organisations experience? And what solutions could they consider in enhancing their practice with refugee men who use violence?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Amanda. And 100% before I do start as well, I'd also like to reiterate the previous presenters and acknowledge the traditional owners of the land across Australia on which we meet on today, and certainly like to acknowledge the Noongar people who are the traditional custodians of the land which I am sitting on at the moment as well. Thank you everybody for tuning in, I guess, to the webinar, and I'll answer the question in a few different points. And the first statement I really want to put out there is that for a long time now, men's behaviour change programs have, for many services, many systems, have really focused on those programs being the only intervention for men who are abusive. They've really focused on a referral, I guess, often to these men's behaviour change programs, and in some way expecting them to create many other changes which were not possible within a soul of the men's behaviour change programs. And so they should not be expected to, of course, also to address all issues, and in particular for men from refugee backgrounds. What does that mean for referrals into men's behaviour change programs? Does it mean that they are not suitable for men from refugee backgrounds? And I would say that we just need to dive a bit deeper there and ask ourselves the questions: should it sit in isolation? Should the men's behaviour change program sit in isolation? And of course, my answer there would be no. It needs to be sitting in with systems. It needs to be sitting in as one cog in many cogs around the behaviour change, but actually around the safety for women and children. So what does that look like? Well, that might be that man actually needs to attend individual counselling to potentially address the trauma. Because another question often comes around men's behaviour change program work is, what is the reason for the violence? Is it the trauma, or do we need to look at the components, particularly around the men's behaviour change program and the abusive behaviours? And my answer to that would be that we don't need to have an all or nothing service. So it may well be that man does need to attend maybe some individual counselling or a service that addresses and looks at that trauma. But we still need to be looking at the behaviours around the abuse towards his partner and his children. So it needs to be sitting in systems alongside many other interventions. And certainly, like Elizabeth was talking about as well. So what is that, around justice, around AOD, around mental health, community, community leaders, mentors. These are all essentially perpetrator interventions. These are all touch points, conversation pieces. They could be an intervention of half an hour, 20 weeks, and much longer. So we need to be looking a lot further than just the men's behaviour change program for that perpetrator intervention would be my first, I guess, opening statement there. And then I think we need to really focus in on what the purpose is. What is the purpose of a perpetrator intervention? And of course, we need to look at the purpose around the safety of women and children. Must remain the focus. So we need to stop just asking as systems, just asking as referring agencies, is this perpetrator intervention suitable for this man? And start to actually ask a further question, and that is, how is this perpetrator intervention going to promote safety and well-being for the women and the children? And a further question, how is this program going to promote and support the children to recover from the abuse and the trauma that he's potentially caused? And how actually is the program as the intervention going to improve stability and family functioning? Because the reality is that we need to consider that maybe even that mental behavior change program is going to do quite the opposite to those questions. And when I say that, is what is the impact if we are asking a man from a refugee background to attend a program that A, he may not be ready for, B, he may be blaming his partner. What is the shame that potentially is across the family unit there as well? What are the repercussions around this man attending a mental behavior change program and going through the systems? Is it actually impacting in a positive way on the safety of women and children? We need to be shifting our thinking in key areas around family and domestic violence. And I guess like Elizabeth was talking about as well, is that this idea around separation creates safety. This idea that if we remove the perpetrator, or we remove the victim survivor, or we remove the children, then in some way there's safety created there. Of course, many times there is, but many times there isn't. And many times actually it may not create the safety and well-being for the women and children involved. And often what we will hear from our victim survivors is that they don't want the relationship to end. They don't want their partner to leave the relationship. They just want the violence to stop. And I think particularly we need to be considering for families from a refugee background, the importance of the family. Who else has, where are the other supports for that family? And particularly, what is the potential retribution or the outcasting for the women in this scenario if the perpetrator was to leave the family, or even if there was disclosure of family domestic violence? So I guess that's one example where we can think, okay, if we just remove the perpetrator, if we just remove the problem, then there's safety that's been created. We need to dive deeper in that and actually question ourselves, is that the result that is actually happening there? And we need to dive deeper into intersectionalities. We need to question ourselves of potentially how is a man from a refugee background using his culture, using potentially the settlement challenges to further oppress his family, to further oppress his partner and his children, to stop her from disclosing. We know that for many refugees, the navigating of the Australian service system, managing racism and discrimination, and undertaking a process of just adjusting to a different social environment is incredibly challenging. But what about as well for the survivors, for the women and children there as well? What is their experience of being that may well prevent them from disclosing violence in the future? Maybe they have disclosed previously and it actually has not created safety and well-being. And we need to have a paradigm shift there from a failure to protect model to a strengths-based model. And it certainly highlights within this project the need for that. And what I mean by that is that we have, for a very long time, placed the responsibility, and still do in many circumstances, the responsibility on the women, on victim survivors, to or their protection, for their safety, for the decisions that they're making around the safety for their children. So, for example, we might say that she did not call the police, so therefore she's failing to protect her children. We might say that she did not take a violent restraining order out, or if she didn't do that, she's not protecting our children, for example. And maybe she even defends him. That paradigm, I guess, is around that failure to protect because she's not doing those things. She must be failing to protect her children. And what I'm putting across here now is shifting that to a strengths-based approach and asking ourselves, okay, what happened last time she called the police? What is the impact if she does take a violent restraining order out? Why might she be defending him, and what might happen if she decides not to defend him? So actually shifting now to a strengths-based, that she's making those decisions under the circumstances, under the pattern of the abusive practices from the perpetrators. She's making decisions that is actually protecting herself and protecting her family members. But we need to really dive deeper and look at what the reasons are under the perpetrator's pattern of abuse.
Yes,
I'm not sure.
Thank you, Mark. You'll have another opportunity in a second to maybe expand on those comments a bit, but we are starting to run a little bit over time. So I'd like to give Elizabeth an opportunity to comment on Mark's points that he's made. And, you know, some of them were very, I think, pertinent, particularly around, you know, we must never lose sight of the fact that safety of women and children really do remain paramount. After Elizabeth has had a chance to comment, I'd like to also ask Colleen if she would like to chip in with a comment, but I'd ask you to keep your comments down to 2 minutes apiece because we are running a little over time.
Thank you. Anything specific, Amanda, you want me to address? I know Mark said quite a bit.
Well, I think towards the end, Mark was talking about the different construct, which was a point you made too. You know, the fact that there are different notions of family within different communities, and also that this can men entering programs here could also impact the women and children, or the people who've been suffering from the violence. It could end up impacting on them potentially in a negative way if it's not thought through carefully and with an understanding of the context of the women and children as well.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I think what I'd add is that, I guess to follow on to what Mark has shared very well, around maintaining the fact that the safety of women and children must remain as a priority. And in working from a strength-based approach, also being guided by the person who is subjected to domestic and family violence, because they are the best, that they understand the person who is perpetrating the abuse more than anyone, because they've lived with the violence. They have the understanding of, when dynamics change within the family home or within the relationship, they're reading that and they're managing that all along. So I think being guided by the person's particular experience, and also being mindful that they also have the best indicators of their own safety and risk. Not always, there are circumstances where that's not the case, but often they know. And so if a person is making a request of a service that from a service point of view doesn't seem to make sense, it's about asking questions to try and understand that person's particular perspective, because it's very likely that they're making those decisions with the understanding of the implications of what will happen next if they take this move as opposed to that move. So I think that's very crucial. And this is a principle that I guess is across the board, regardless of the woman's particular cultural background. But in particular, when we talk about refugee background communities, that is perhaps more pronounced because often practitioners are working with very little information where they don't have the full picture or they may not understand what's happening in the background. So being guided by the woman is key. And also in working from a strengths-based approach, providing people with information and with options and allowing them to make an informed decision. Because it's also about how, as practitioners, you model what a healthy, respectful relationship looks like. And I think that even though it's a different relationship because it's a professional/client relationship, it's also an opportunity to work with people in a manner that is safe, that is holistic, and that recognizes their individual strengths as well.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Did you want to add anything, Colleen?
No, I don't think so, Amanda. I just want to reiterate the notion of the strengths-based approach and also the issue around intersectionality. Yeah,
okay. Just a reminder to the audience, don't forget to submit your question to the panel, but you can do that by clicking on the blue icon at the top of your screen. We're now going to hear about the key recommendations from the research report. So I'm going to turn back to Colleen and ask you if you could tell us a bit about those recommendations.
Great, thanks, Amanda. I just really want to mention three of the key recommendations today. And first up, I think key to developing, implementing and also evaluating interventions that are based on the best practice principles is really the importance of agencies engaging in a genuine manner with refugee communities. When we're engaged, when that engagement can actually work to ensure a greater uptake of the intervention because it will be culturally appropriate, it will be seen to emanate from within the community, and that engagement will actually facilitate ownership of the intervention. We also recognise that community members also have a very good understanding of their respective communities, and they understand which community structures can actually be leveraged to support the intervention. That engagement also has latent benefits. Agencies, when they're working in partnership with communities, can also lead to an increased understanding of domestic and family violence and also Australian responses within the communities, and can actually also work to break down any myths about services that may be present within the communities. That partnership and engagement can also build capacity within the communities around safe and appropriate ways to address domestic and family violence. Bearing in mind what Elizabeth was talking about earlier about community members often initially disclosing within community. Secondly, to fully utilise the best practice principles, we really need to expand how we conceptualise the domestic and family violence sector and recognise refugee services as an important part. And as part of those that developing of connections, agencies, I think, we also need to really think about, well, how do we build those connections? How do we build those networks and partnerships? And how do we work together collaboratively? But I think there are definite benefits in doing that. If we get that right, then there's really an opportunity to share our expertise, share knowledge, and share skills between the respective agencies. And what that enables is that components of any intervention can be developed and or delivered by those who really have the specialist knowledge to be able to do so. And finally, the key recommendation that I want to talk about is that really if we're going to optimally utilise the best practice principles, then alternate service delivery models that do not necessarily involve family separation will actually need to be developed. I do really want to stipulate again that that should only occur when it's safe to do so and the woman's choice for it to occur. But it will require significant amount of work. And importantly, when or if these models are developed, they will require robust monitoring and evaluation to ensure safety and accountability. Thanks, Amanda.
Right. Thanks very much, Colleen. So I can go now to Mark and Elizabeth, and I'm going to ask if you would each like to make one fairly short comment about what Colleen has said, and perhaps in the context of how these recommendations could be taken up by organisations. But we also need to get to the question and answer session, so people do have some time to ask some questions. So, Mark, can I ask you to make perhaps the initial comment, and then Elizabeth, if you could follow up from him.
Yes, sure. I'll be very brief. So 100% definitely appreciate when we get to the panel discussion there as well. I think the main 2 points very quickly I'd like to make is the importance of building partnerships and building working relationships across systems, that we can't continue to work in isolation, whether it's a men's behaviour change program, whether it's justice, whether it's whichever community, whichever service we're looking at. We need to be working together and sharing each other's skills. And this document, the project findings, key findings, we can't just leave this on the shelf. It needs to also go. There's also the practice standards for perpetrator interventions that these marry up with, particularly with the men's behaviour change programs. So these cannot be in isolation, and we need to be developing stronger partnerships.
Thank you, Mark. Elizabeth, did you have something to add?
Yeah, just very quickly, I guess also to build on what Mark has mentioned, in the spirit of working collaboratively from a strengths-based approach and working with communities, I think it's vital that services understand, I guess, some of their own limitations, as well as the structural biases that are inherent within services, but also the systemic issues as well, and how sometimes, quite often, there are gaps within the system, and how practitioners or service providers can, I guess, to be more creative in finding ways to be able to work with the limitations that they're often confronted with, but also in continuing to check and address internal biases as well is crucial.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Colleen, did you want to add anything to that? We were going to have a bit more of an open panel discussion now, but I think we probably do need to move to questions. But if you would like to just add something to what Mark and Elizabeth have said.
Look, I really don't think I have anything to add, Amanda. I'm very happy to go to take questions from the floor.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you very much to the panel members, Mark, Colleen and Elizabeth. And I just want to remind everybody in the audience that the research is available on the ANROWS website. There's both a research report and a policy and practice paper under the same title as this seminar. We'll now go into the question and answer session. And as I've said a couple of times, you can submit your questions by clicking the blue icon at the top right-hand side of your screen. And we do have one question in, which I'll put to the panel. How can we work with refugees to enhance their trust of government institutions and agencies, given that they may have come from situations where systems have not been trusted before?
I think, Amanda, I'll start off on that if I may. I think that's a really important question. And I guess for me, it's a process. It will take time. It's not something that will happen overnight. And for me, I think it's relationship-based. I think if we're working in partnership with communities is a really powerful way of affecting any change, and the community, having the community members themselves, I guess, leading that change. If we're doing that, then we get greater insight. The community members can provide insight into where that distrust may have come from. Provide insight also into potentially what's driving that distrust. But also importantly, I think, insights into the best ways to address it in the respective communities. So once again, drawing on the strengths within the communities and recognising that it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all. So for me, it's relationship-based, strengths-based, and working at that grassroots level on a bottom-up way of dispelling that mistrust.
Right. And Mark or Elizabeth, would you like to add to that?
Yes, yeah, certainly. I guess I 100% concur. And it's going to be a marathon and not a sprint. This is not an easy flick a switch and everything is going to be fine. This is a reality that people have experienced, people from refugee backgrounds have experienced. And I think if we are talking about particularly women, victim survivors from refugee backgrounds, really needing to respect and understand their experiences, positive and negative, with systems, and being able to understand in the context of family domestic violence, actually, that it may well be not, as I said before, in her best interest in regards to safety at various times and throughout the systems, and we need to appreciate that for her decision, making that in the best interest of her family, not that she doesn't need the support from others.
Yes, I do recall from, very early on when the original research was done in Western Australia, which Colleen was involved in, looking at the perceptions of family and domestic violence among 5 African refugee communities, that, the issue of this lack of trust of services, institutions that dealt with family and domestic violence came up a lot amongst the people who responded to the research, who undertook the surveys. And I think the other issue, though, was that there were some people who actually indicated they were quite grateful to be living in a place where the law could be on their side if, in fact, they were experiencing violence. So people's responses are very different, I think, to things, but we should bear in mind that, yes, a lot of people from refugee backgrounds have obviously had extremely negative experiences with authoritative institutions and systems in their countries of origin, perhaps. Another question that's come in is how do we, what is the best strategy to use to be able to separate your professional self and your cultural self when dealing with a man from the same cultural background as yourself? Maybe, Mark, you might want to pick up with that one first.
Yeah, and, well, I guess Elizabeth certainly has mentioned it a couple of times as well, and that's first of all recognising our own biases, recognising our own understanding of family domestic violence. And, I guess as far as a practical piece that needs to support that work is the supervision, is the reflection piece with somebody else, whether it's in your organisation or outside of your organisation, because we need to be recognising of maybe how that refugee man, the perpetrator, may use that or to his advantage around inviting collusion. That, okay, you're from the same culture, you know what it's like. So I guess being prepared for that it's going to happen and being prepared about what your response would be. But again, reiterating what Elizabeth's already mentioned, is being very aware of your own biases and how they're going to play out in your practices.
Exactly. Any other panel member want to comment on that question?
I don't really have anything to add, Amanda, being a researcher rather than a practitioner. Right. I think I'd prefer to leave it to the practitioners, yeah.
Okay, fair enough. Another interesting question is, how can you balance validating the trauma from the country of origin with accountability for behaviour within the family? So in other words, yes, trauma does play into this, and obviously probably the majority of men from refugee backgrounds who are perpetrating family and domestic violence would have had a whole lot of trauma in their life at some point or another, being a refugee. But how do you deal with that on the one hand, but also encourage accountability for behaviour?
Sorry, I don't want to just jump in. Do you want to talk to that, Elizabeth?
Sure.
Right.
I would say I guess it's you're right in that often people from refugee backgrounds have had a history of trauma pre-arrival, and that often continues post-arrival as well. I think there's not as much done in the post-arrival trauma space. But I think it's about recognizing that, yes, that there may be a history of trauma, and we don't dismiss that. We recognize and validate that, but also that the issue of domestic and family violence and the correlation with trauma is a very complex space. I think in holding people accountable for their behavior, it's about recognizing that, yes, there's a multitude of factors that will that make the situation much more complex. But it's not necessarily as clear-cut as if you've experienced trauma, then you are automatically predisposed to being abusive or being victimized by domestic and family violence. Certainly there's a correlation. I think it's about holding people accountable for their action and their behavior, providing the services that they need to address the various intersectional issues, again, the trauma issue, the settlement issue, the issues around acculturation, etc., but addressing the issue of domestic and family violence as an issue in and of itself. I think we can never get away from recognizing the fact that people make conscious decisions to behave in certain ways to certain people in their lives. So I would say that is, I think it's a space that requires a lot more work, but I would say that we can never lose sight of the need to hold people accountable for their behavior. Obviously, in also addressing the multitude of other issues, but the issue of domestic and family violence must be addressed with recognition of the intersecting factors, but it has to be addressed in terms of the person who is perpetrating that behavior.
Okay.
I agree.
All right. Thanks. Yeah, that's good stuff. Okay, thanks, Elizabeth. We'll just quickly do one more question, which has come in, which is, would you suggest that working with elders of particular communities is a good idea, and does this assist the process of groups understanding the damage that can be done by family and domestic violence?
I might just sort of start off on that one, if I may. Certainly when we're looking at refugee communities, leaders and elders play a very prominent role in the community, and they are looked to and turned to in times of, for support and what have you. I think there is real value in working with leaders. When we look at refugee communities, within the communities there are a number of leaders and elders who do not have violence condoning attitudes. They're really wanting to work to reduce and eliminate family and domestic violence in their communities. So I think there's real strength in working with them and leveraging from their influence in the communities when we're working around this particular issue.
Yeah, especially given with people with refugee backgrounds, that sort of community involvement is so important anyway. Thank you very much, and thank you to the entire panel. Thank you from ANROWS in particular for your participation in this panel. Thank you to the audience for coming. But before I sign out, I'll just give you some final important information. So this the recording from this webinar will be available on the ANROWS website for on-demand viewing, and you can let your colleagues know about that too. The research report, Best Practice Principles for Interventions with Domestic and Family Violence Perpetrators from Refugee Backgrounds, is also on the ANROWS website. Diversity Focused is running a webinar and 2 workshops on domestic and family violence in cross-cultural context in the COVID-19 environment, and you can go to the website, which is www.diversityfocus.com.au for further information about that. If you're interested in more information about upcoming webinars being run by ANROWS, please visit their website. The next one is on the 26th of May and features a discussion with Kate Jenkins, who is the Sex Discrimination Commissioner, on the Respect at Work Sexual Harassment National Inquiry Report. And that's it from us. I thank you very much for your participation, and good afternoon.